Did you know that the way that you search on your podcast platform for new shows, the way that people are finding new podcasts on Google and even on YouTube is different? This podcast episode is going to answer a lot of things about how podcast algorithms work, search keywords, metadata, all these things that have been thrown around in the podcast industry for a while. It's going to be answering so many things, and promise that at the end of the episode, you're going to be leaving with tons of notes. And I'm recording this podcast episode in Paris, and I'll tell you exactly with whom. All right, let's dive into this week's episode of the Podcast Space. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm an award-winning podcast marketer, and I teach you about practical ways to leverage your podcast for visibility, influence, and networking. Let's go. All right, with me here on the show is Jennifer Hahn. She is the Chief Marketing Officer for Ausha, and I am recording this in their office. Like, I was so excited.
We are so pleased to have you here, Anna. Thank you for visiting us.
Honestly, it's been such a joy. I've known Ausha for maybe 2-3 years now.
Yeah, I think at least like 3 editions of Summer Pod Move, right?
Yeah. Podcast Movement, Vegas, 2023.
Oh yeah, Vegas was the first one. Yes. Yeah, it was so fun.
Oh, that was so great. And I think that that's one of the things about working in the podcast industry that really shows you that everyone who is working in this industry really is passionate. And that's one of the things that I love about the Ausha team, is that they're always innovating and thinking about how can we improve the user experience? How can we help podcasters grow? But I really want to talk about how can podcasters think about podcast search optimization in a different way, because it's still something that is a new concept. And I want to make sure that people know of how practical really it is. And some data that you've shared in one of your presentations at Podcast Movement was that 70% of people search on podcast apps, and they open a Spotify, they open an Apple Podcasts, and they search on the app. So why is this important?
You know what? For once, before getting into big data, and you know that I'm a data junkie, but I also wanted to share with you and kind of empathy-driven exercise I always like to do is always asking around me, to people who are listening to podcasts, how did you found, the latest the podcast you discovered? What about you, Anna?
Yeah, it was a kind of like, for me, it's always personal recommendation, because my time is so specific to listening that I find it like that. But my sister, actually, she Googled something. Oh,
interesting. Mm-hmm. And, as a matter of fact, with my little personal poll, what I discovered is of course, a lot of people are talking about they got recommendations from friends, or they saw some mentions into medias and so on. But a surprising number told me that they were just browsing into Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and this is how they discovered the new show they're listening to right now. Most of the time, they explain to me that they have a topic in mind, I don't know what about murder in Texas. Well, that might not be a great example. Sorry for that, but you know what I mean. Yeah. They're thinking about the topic, and then they are typing into the search bar, and then they see a lot of results of shows and episodes they never heard about, and they just choose among them, And personally, I do so as well. A concrete example. Just a few days ago, I was we are getting personal. I was putting my son to bed, and I need to say that night I was super very tired and kind of lazy. Not my proudest parenting moment there. Right? Okay. But so I just opened Apple Podcast, and I type in, I think it was kids bedtime stories, thing like that. And I just click on the first result I found. And you know what? 3 minutes later, he fell asleep.
Nice.
And so was I, by the way, but that's another subject. And it was a show I never heard about. I didn't know about this one. And after that, we loved it. We loved the story, and I followed the show. And, tonight we are planning to listen to another episode of that show, and we become loyal listener to that show, And we are not the only one doing that, I'm taking my own personal example, but as a matter of fact, according to big studies, such as the Discovery Stat 2024 from the podcast host, they discovered that first, 1 in 2 podcast listeners are discovering new shows to listen to directly into podcast apps. And among them, 70% of them use the search bar to do so. And if you get curious, because I know that you're super curious, right? You want more. Well, in second come the chart and category browser sections.
Yep.
It's used by among 24% of listeners. And last is the app's editorial recommendation. And this is only used by among 6%.
Wow. Okay.
But it makes sense when you think about it, because with another data, according Edison research, in the US, most podcast listeners tune in an average of, I think it's 8 to 9 different shows, and they're constantly searching for something new to listen to, So it's so logical that, they are doing it directly into the app. They're already using it,
It made me think that you said so many things. I like, we're both data nerds, but it's true that, when you're thinking about, a lot of people think about, I want to submit my podcast to Apple Podcasts to be featured or to Spotify to be featured. And those are such small chances of being discovered, because you were just talking about like how people go through the recommendations within the apps is such a lower percentage, which it really makes me think about the amount of people who did search like you, right? Who go on the app, kind of like when you go on YouTube, how you go on Google,
exactly.
Which brings me beautifully to the second part. We don't optimize our podcast for new listeners, right? And so let's talk a little bit about those behaviors, because you said you found a podcast that matched the query that you were searching for, right?
Yeah.
So it's truly important that you think about it. I'm looking at the camera right now, but like pay attention right now. That we think about the listener journey, right? And so as creators, we can't think about the lazy way, which is I'll just do a whatever title, or just do a whatever description. My name of the podcast is like a whatever, because I just want to start. So,
and that's a big mistake.
Yes. So would you want to talk a little bit more about
from the creator perspective?
Yeah.
So as a creator, how can you end in this search result? How can you get there? Well, first thing you have to know is you have to understand is like search engines are all about words. So just to make it simple, like if Apple Podcasts and Spotify, if you want to appear in the search results for any keyword, any request, well, you have to at least get this keyword into your metadata. So by metadata, I mean all your show notes, episode notes, offer name, tags, and even transcription for some podcast apps. So first thing is to have the word into your notes and so on. But the good news is when you have the words, well, you can appear. But the bad news is that you are not alone there. Because remember, we have like more than 5 million shows on Spotify and maybe a bit more on Apple Podcasts, So you have to also build a whole podcast search strategy. It seems big taking like this, but in fact, it's really simple if you break it down. But, you have to think about the strategy. You don't, as you mentioned, like, just putting a random title or something a bit fuzzy, of course, is not enough, because how do you want listeners to find you if you are not like speaking their words,
As a side note, I always say if you're being lazy yourself on the work that you're putting in, how can you expect your listeners to not be lazy themselves, right?
Exactly.
So you need to put in the work to be found by your listeners. You shouldn't put the work on them.
Exactly. So you have to put the work in, but you have to put the words in as well. But the thing is, you have like potentially like thousands or even millions of potential keywords, you can target, you can use. But the thing is, in your show notes and so on, you are limited in terms of a number of characters. So you can't stuff them all in, So you have to start by defining a list of your prioritized targeted keywords, you have to choose what are the most relevant for you, for your show. But also, you need to target the one with the strongest search volume, because if you are just like trying to get a keyword with only type in by 10 people, it doesn't really matter. Right. You are looking for the one most in demand, right? And how do you know about which one are most in demand, right? Well, this is where Ausha PSO comes in, right? Because in our tool, we provide that indicator for each keyword, to give you a sense of which keyword are having the highest volume. So then it can bring you also the more reach, if you target them. So if you have a lot of competition on a keyword, you might be like really at the bottom of the list. Okay. And you have to understand that, like all the listeners, they won't scroll endlessly, They will be all lazy like me. They will just like,
first top 5, top 3.
Of course, click on to like from the top 5 to top 10 if, they are being more motivated. But they will click on the first results. So your job, after having your word is to climb up to the ranking until you try to reach the top, of the search result. And how do you do that? Well, first you need to understand where are you ranked at,
right.
Because you don't even know if you're on the top or in the middle or at the bottom or so on. Then you need to identify who are the shows and the episodes above you. So meaning your competitors on your keyword, right? And you need to understand if you are doing better than them, and you need to analyze them and try to optimize your own metadata to be able to do better than them and then outrank them on that keyword. Again, that's exactly why, like all the tools we are providing to help you to identify all the list of competitors for each keyword. We have a kind of a metadata checker to help you optimize continuously and so on. And of course, we have all the analytics that help you track at which rank you are for each keyword. And because, you're getting into it's kind of a race because you are optimizing your metadata, but others are optimizing as well, right? So you are racing them. And so it helps you to also keep track of every progress and so on.
Okay. You shared so many practical things. And I think that a lot of people, the main takeaway from the get-go is know your angle, right? Know exactly what you're going to be talking about. And from there, think about how would your listeners describe this? Because I find that a lot of people will have, especially the language is, again, the language / keywords is very important because you as an expert, for instance, if let's say you're using it for business, you may use a specific word, but your listeners actually use a different word. And if you don't take the time to really think it through, you're going to be using specific words that don't resonate with your listeners. And I think that just in itself, it's just so important to think about. Mm-hmm. And then we move into okay, I know the words, but are people actually searching for that? And sure, you can use Google, but the thing is not everyone will. And I like the idea that let's go where people are. Yeah. So let's go to the podcast platforms. And there will be a couple of things that will vary from country to country. But I actually want to ask you something. So what about the niche shows? So let's say there's a show with a small audience. So what would be a keyword strategy that you would consider?
Well, I think for a niche show, it's even more interesting, to adopt the search strategy because if we're talking about niche shows, mostly for listeners interested by niche show might be also typing in niche keywords into the search bar because they're looking for a very specific topic. And I think, there will be, so first advantage is that you have less competition than on your niche keyword, right? You might have less search volume though, but then you have to adopt the long tail strategy, meaning that you need to accumulate a lot of niche keywords, to have a nice cumulative audience. But I think when they arrive on the search result, all the listeners will be more engaged, because if you are more specialized on one topic, it means you're also more expert.
Right. And so I guess that's the difference is that's when using a tool like PSO or any other tool to help you understand what are people actually searching for, will be the difference between what I call an active marketing strategy and a passive. And when it's more passive is really optimizing that metadata, those titles, those descriptions, so that when you're at home cooking, you're at doing whatever, running, people can still find the show without you having to post a promo, without you having to send out a newsletter. And I think that from the perspective of doing that work beforehand will save you hours of time of not having to just basically market the podcast. So think it from that kind of that other side. The work you put in the beginning will optimize the long term.
Yeah, definitely. And when choosing, your keyword, you made a good point. Is always the right balance between trying to get the higher search volume, but also, keep the relevancy according your podcast and your topic. Because in any case, if you are just opportunistic and try to get the higher search volume keywords, but they're not relevant at all to your topic. In any case, you might appear, but nobody will click on it, Right. So all the search algorithm at a certain point will just put at the end of the list. So you won't be visible.
Or even another thing, which is if they may click, but then that's going to affect your retention rate or your consumption rate. Yeah. So when you're looking at your podcast, it's why is everyone dipping out after 5 minutes? And you're Oh, because
and that's by signals for all the podcast apps as well. So
yeah, exactly. So like, just don't try to like outsmart the platforms, because then it will still come back to you. So I really like that. So should we talk a little bit about the optimization for Apple Podcasts and Spotify? So can we talk a little bit about how it's different?
Well, Apple Podcasts and Spotify have different search algorithm, but they have common criteria. And some of them are platform specific, but of course they don't display. This is their secret recipe. The weight of each criteria, in the algorithm. But for example, if we start with Apple Podcast, so of course Apple Podcast start by checking first all the keywords into your metadata. According to them, they are stating publicly that they are checking like the show name, channel name, offer name, and also the transcription.
Okay.
According our own study, and you know what, we haven't published them yet, so this is exclusive data for you, Anna. My gift for you. But we discovered that the metadata that impact the most the search algorithm are the show name, the episode title, and the offer name. And on top of metadata,
when you say offer name,
the name of the hosts on the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You can also like hack that and put some keyword in it. And the second criteria they're looking at is like all the user behaviors, and they're mostly look at the plays and the number of follows that came directly from the search result, and that's a strong signal for them. And the last dimension is like the overall popularity of the show. So they are checking at the overall number of plays and follows across the app. So that says for Apple Podcasts. And for Spotify, they have a more broader approach, and they're way more trend driven. So they're also checking the metadata, but they're taking into account more metadata. So they're looking at the show and episode title, the show and episode description, the offer name as well. They're also taking into account they try to get signal about the user behaviors as well. They look at also the plays, the follows, but also how many people add, the content to their playlist, their personal playlist. One very important criteria for Spotify is the freshness of your content. So we found out that with our own test and own study that 2 out of 3 podcasts that appeared in the search results have published the content like less than 15 days ago. So this is really important for Spotify. And one last thing, but I don't think like creators can really do anything about that. Spotify's magic lies into the user personalized recommendation. Like if you're listening to Taylor Swift, they will show you other type of music like very similar. They're doing the same for podcast. So this will also influence a bit what the user will see into the app.
Gosh, that in itself was so good. I've been on some of the studies that y'all revealed, and user behavior is kind of sometimes something that people don't think about, but that in itself is like, that's what you can control. You can't control an algorithm, but you can control how the algorithm finds your content. Yeah. And it kind of sounds like a lot of times people go, oh, there's, the magic, the dark magic of Spotify and the dark magic of like Apple Podcasts. And so one of the things that I actually thought about, we didn't mention this before, but you didn't say the rates and reviews. Right? Because there's these misconception that Apple Podcasts have to have like a gazillion reviews in order for them to show your podcast, which is not true. Data has shown that that's not the case. But I love that, the frequency is something that people, that Spotify matters a lot. But what about for seasonal shows? Like
each algorithm, I told you, like they are checking like the popularity, the user behavior, the freshness, of course, but they're not the only criteria, right, in the algorithm, because they still look at the metadata first. And you can control, of course, your publishing, but if you already have, your planning and so on, you can still work on the metadata side. And we have a lot of clients who work on their back catalog episode. Our client at the BBC Studios, she worked her podcast search strategy with our tool only on back catalog episode. This is how she went from invisible to top 6 on her main keywords. And overall in the show, Spotify search became their second sources of listenings. So, and they have like no new episodes during that time.
Amazing. Yes, that's something that I've actually done. I love that what we're sharing on this episode is like, if this happens, you still have a chance to improve on your catalog. Because in between seasons, I did that. In between season 3 and season 4, I went back and I optimized the show notes. I added chapters. I included more keywords. I beefed up the descriptions. It just carried on consistently having downloads. So I love that if people, like, for instance, if you're a business owner and you only release like one season and that season is really good, but answers everything that the questions that your listeners have, you can still continue seeing growth if you just keep tweaking those things. And that's batching work that you sit down and you go through it for hours. So then I want to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of metadata. Where do you spend the most time versus the least time? Let's say it like that.
Okay, for both Apple and Spotify, if you want to cover it all, of course, you have to improve all your metadata from all the show notes, episode notes, offer naming, etc. But if you really have to prioritize and choose, I would say like you need to craft very carefully your titles, like both your show titles and episode titles. Because first, these are the metadata that both platforms are checking about. Right. But not only the search algorithm will read them first, also the listeners will see them first, because once you're in the search results, the second stage is to be clicked by the listeners, So if your title is not optimized, if you're like, as you mentioned earlier, you're putting like just episode 1, but episode 1 about what? Well, first of all, you will never appear in the result, but you see what I mean. Listeners won't click on it, so you won't have any engagement. So the same way you will drop down.
Yeah. And I always think about it, like, have you searched for your own podcast? Like, on your mobile device, for instance, like you will have a lot less space, like the character count is way smaller. And I normally think about optimize for machines and humans. I always think because machines may show the result, but humans are the ones who click.
Yeah, and you make a very good point because you're right. Titles are very limited, so you need to put there the most important and relevant keyword for you in it.
Right in the beginning. Yeah. But also, I think I look at titles and descriptions as complementary. Yeah. So if the title wasn't like completely kind of descriptive about what the episode was, can I do it within the first 2 to 3 lines? Because of the description, because then if I'm not sure, I'll go, oh, hang on. So that's why people shouldn't start in this episode, because if you just have in this episode of the podcast space, award-winning podcast marketer N. Xavier is joined by, like, for most podcast platforms, that's already the 2 lines or the 3 lines.
That's
So
true.
you end up not knowing what it is, right?
Yeah, that's true. But when it comes to descriptions, I'm always advising the clients to, take the first paragraph for a human, and they take the rest of the 4,000 characters for the algorithm.
Ooh, that's a good tip. Okay, love that. That's a really good tip. Awesome. All right. So was there anything else about the metadata that we didn't talk about that you think we should add?
I think we covered it all, but if you have more questions, like just
all right, we're closing. We're getting to the close, but I want to talk a little bit about the importance of looking at tracking, because, like, for instance, something as simple as signing up for a podcast tracking on the charts. So I know Ausha has, Mopod has. I know that we used to use Chartable. So I think it's important to know, and just because it's free. So make sure that you're tracking if your podcast is ranking anywhere, because then that's like a trigger. They're like, oh, people are listening in Croatia. Like, I saw that my podcast was trending in Ireland, like number 22 in the charts. Whoop, whoop.
Congrats.
I'm like, come on, Ireland. But, like, you may not know. So that's like a very simple step that, one, gamifies the experience to go, oh my gosh, like I'm trending in Ireland. Yeah. Yes, book me a trip. But, it's also like a good reminder that those markets are different. That could be opportunities. So should we talk about that, like the importance of tracking?
Let me precise that, like charts, like top charts are different from the search result. So as we said at the beginning, first of all, like listeners are not like are still browsing, of course, that part, but only 24% are browsing like the like category charts, and I think it was only less than 2% are browsing like the top charts indeed.
Wow.
Yeah, and the thing is, being in the top charts, meaning that it means that your show is already like quite successful, right? And even let's say like smaller country like Ireland and so on. Yes. Congrats again. But for me, it's more about the end goal, because to get into the chart, it means that you already got a lot of plays and so on. So it's like a sign that you did a great job, but you still have to do the job first, and you still have to be visible first. Yeah. And that is why, all the search part is more accessible and more controllable for creators in order to climb up. But of course, you need to track all of that. But you're definitely right. When it comes to charts, and I'm doing like a little auto promo here, but we launch a free tool to track your charts. And so do not hesitate to check on Ausha.co. And you can like definitely see where, like when you stand at for each category. But again, this is the end goal. Right? You need to work on your great content first. You need to work on the great promotion second, and you need to work on your overall visibility in order to get the listeners. And then the listeners, with their love, with their plays and so on, they will help you get into the charts.
Right. All right. Last but not least, I only have 2 more questions, but let's talk a little bit about misconceptions about PSO. Because a lot of people are like, well, if I'm optimizing my podcast for Google, why should I care about the podcast search optimization?
Well, because it has nothing to do with Google SEO. So I have to say that PSO, the podcast search optimization name, is like we crafted ourselves. And of course, we inspired from SEO, but SEO is the search optimization for websites on Google or other web search engine. And when we're talking about PSO, it's more how do you optimize the visibility into the search of podcast apps like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So they have nothing to do. They are different ecosystem. They are different algorithm. They are different way of working your visibility. Where Google is on most of the time on the website. Here we're talking about applications. So it's very different way of managing things.
And just a side note I want to say is that not everyone who searches on the internet is a podcast listener.
Yeah.
People who use podcast apps are podcast listeners.
That's
why it's important to look at it first.
And like I get that creating like a new name, can also like confuse people. But I truly believe that as an expert marketer, we shouldn't mix everything up. It's really important to, make them understand that there are 2 different strategies. Also because, working your visibility of your podcast in the SEO for Google does exist as well. Since we launched, we have, like, for example, we are working with agencies that were, they used to work on podcast SEO visibility for Google. And now they are diversifying and added PSO services to propose to their clients. And they told us that, in fact, it was really good and really convenient to have distinct name, because then they can explain to their client that there are different value to each strategy.
And, even when I'm talking to peers, there's a lot of people that do not talk. They say, search engine for podcast platforms. I'm like, that has a name, y'all. So and it's confusing. So if you're using the right terms, I appreciate.
Yeah, we still need to evangelize that,
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, Jen. Was there anything that you wanted to add that we didn't cover?
No, I just had such a fun time. Thank you, Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's so excited. And we got to have this wonderful lady here on the show. Thank you again. So this is the time where I say, I have a few more resources on the website about actual search optimization for Google, for YouTube, that I leave the links in the show notes so you can compare after listening to this episode. So I highly recommend that you listen. And then we'll leave in the show notes a link for you to try. I'll leave the affiliate link. Oh my goodness, the affiliate link in the show notes for you to click and try PSO. They also have PSO Academy, right?
Yeah.
So you can actually learn how to use the tool.
Yeah, we have a whole guide into the Ausha Academy where like you have all the breakdown of a strategy in a few steps. Very simple.
Yes, perfect. All right. So everything will be in the show notes. Jen, thank you again. I will recommend that you continue listening to just more resources. You go check out Ausha.co, not com.co. And I've been Anna Xavier. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.